We don't know where the situation with Iran is going, but we can be certain that if it breaks into a full-blown war, a few things will be true. It will likely cost much more than they tell you, possibly hundreds of billions of dollars. At the end, America is likely to be weaker than it was at the beginning, and we know this for certain: our biggest rival will be stronger. Who's our biggest rival? It's not Iran, despite what they tell you in Washington. It is, needless to say, China. While we're continuing to squander money and blood in Baghdad and many other capitals in that region, China is growing its economy at home, even as it expands its reach throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, even the heartland of the United States. One person who's paying close attention to this, one of the few who cares, is J.D. Vance, the author, of course, of Hillbilly Elegy, and we're happy to have him on our show tonight. J.D., thanks so much for coming on. I don't think anybody mourns the death of Soleimani in this country anyway, but I wonder what the Chinese think as they watch this.
Well, I think one thing they're thinking is that just as the past two American presidencies have been bogged down in the Middle East in various ways, this conflict risks escalating in a way that makes America focus on the Middle East for yet another few years, maybe another 10 years, even as the Chinese grow in military might and economic power. And we know, of course, that they're planting various infrastructure and economic institutions all over Africa, all over Asia, that their entire economy is growing and flourishing. And yet, again, we risk focusing on this small region of the world that is obviously important, but not nearly as important as our biggest geopolitical rival, continue to gain strength and power.
Well, that's exactly right. And so now, especially that this country is energy independent, we were promised for decades, once we became energy independent, we wouldn't have to focus all of our energy in the Middle East. Now we are, and yet our energies are still focused there, and we're still ignoring China. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One, we have an entire generation of American intellectuals, frankly on both the left and the right, who grew up thinking that the Middle East was just the most important region of the world. And so one way of thinking about American policy really for the past 20 years, the George W. Bush administrations, of course the Barack Obama administrations, is that we had these successive wars. We basically had one new war per term: Iraq, and then Afghanistan, then Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria during the Obama terms. And that's obviously terrible, and I think you can make a good argument that none of those wars has actually been good for America's national interest. But viewed from the Chinese perspective, it's kept us constantly bogged down in these regions. And of course, the people who predicted that focusing on these regions would be good for America's national interests are still advising presidents, are still advising senators and diplomats. And the few people who recognize that China was a major, major threat are still a little bit on the sidelines of the mainstream foreign policy conversation. I think it's a disaster, but if you understand sort of the American foreign policy establishment, it's not actually surprising to understand why that's happening.
I mean, just a macro question to end on. Why is it so hard for our elites to police themselves? If someone is consistently wrong about the big things, why is he still in the same job? If we allowed our heart surgeons to keep working with that kind of track record, no one would survive surgery. So why do we allow our policymakers to be wrong time and again?
Well, Tucker, I'll give you a cynical answer and then a less cynical answer. I mean, the less cynical answer is basically that a lot of people just aren't very good and very smart at what they do. And honestly, I actually hope that's the answer, because the more cynical answer is that as our country has successively bungled Middle Eastern wars and allowed China to rise, there is, of course, a group of people who've gotten very wealthy off of China's growing power, and that's the financial elites who actually run the country, who donate to the think tanks, of course, that produce the policy papers that so many of our politicians rely on. And so I do think that one way of recognizing that there's been a massive failure here is that the people who have not been in service of the American national interests are still collecting a paycheck, and the people who have gotten it right are still largely on the fringes. And I think that's fundamentally a story of incentives and a story of who donors are benefiting from and who donors are paying to effectively issue what is propaganda. successively bungled Middle Eastern wars and allowed China to rise. There is, of course, a group of people who've gotten very wealthy off of China's growing power, and that's the financial elites who actually run the country, who donate to the think tanks, of course, that produce the policy papers that so many of our politicians rely on. And so I do think that one way of recognizing that there's been a massive failure here is that the people who have not been in service of the American national interests are still collecting a paycheck, and the people who have gotten it right are still largely on the fringes. And I think that's fundamentally a story of incentives and a story of who donors are benefiting from and who donors are paying to effectively issue what is propaganda.